Hi everyone. Welcome again to Baden Hill. I'll never forget 1984. My first experience attending the Olympic Games. I was in Los Angeles because I lived nearby in Orange County, California. And it was only likely, only obvious, only logical that I would get to go and see the track and field day at the Olympic Games at the Coliseum in Los Angeles. It was a very special time. A time for me to bond with my dad. A time to hear amazing music playing, surrounding me with the feeling that the world was a very miraculous and marvelous place. And to see all the countries of the world coming together in peace. Even though the Soviet Union and its allies had boycotted the games in Los Angeles, they were still a huge success. Peter Ueberroth had been the one who was responsible for organizing the games, and he had managed to actually make a profit for the city. Most Olympics lose money for the city in which they're held and for the country as a whole. But Los Angeles was different. It was a time of hope. Now, imagine that day of hope turned into a day of nightmares. That's what happened for people who attended the Munich Olympics in 1972. West Germany was a miracle. It had been the enemy controlled by Hitler and his Nazi party during World War II. But by the transformation that only happens through miracles, West Germany was a free society with a desire to show the world that it was a new place with a new beginning. And the games were supposed to be carefree. The desire of the West German government was that people felt safe and that people understood that this is how the world should be. In the middle of the night, 11 people, members of the Israeli track and field team and Olympic team, the wrestling team and the fencing team, they were surprised by invaders in their dormitory. 2 of them were killed right away. 9 of them then were taken hostage. And this crisis happened because the Germans didn't want too much security. They didn't want it to feel like a police state. They wanted people to have confidence that all was well. And that led to the attackers actually climbing over a chain link fence. And they were helped to climb over that chain link fence by some other athletes who thought they were just out for a night on the town and were just trying to get back into their rooms. No one suspected that these were Palestinian terrorists, along with a couple of other radical German terrorists who wanted to force the government to release prisoners. That's what the terrorists wanted. They wanted the prisoners released. Even though the West Germans offered them an unlimited amount of money, and they even said that they would allow Germans to be taken prisoner in the place of these Israeli athletes. You see, West Germany, they knew what it would be to the world if Israelis were killed in Germany, if Jewish athletes were killed in Germany. It was a nightmare crisis. There was no way out. The police tried to negotiate, but the terrorists refused. Finally, the police pretended to agree, and their intention was to ambush the terrorists and rescue the hostages. But it all went terribly bad. The terrorists figured it out, and they blew up the helicopter that contained the hostages, and all of the athletes, the Israeli athletes, all died. All of the attackers, except for 3, were killed. And those 3 attackers then, they were kept in prison But the story didn't end there. A month later, a German commercial airliner for Lufthansa was hijacked. And the hijackers said, "You need to free those attackers or we will blow up this plane." And the West German government just didn't want any more heartache, and they wanted the nightmare to end, and they allowed those attackers to go free. Later on, it turned out that the Israelis, kind of secret police, they went and they tracked down some of those involved, and they carried out justice on their own. But this is an episode that will always be a part of our Olympic history. When we should be thinking about world peace and cooperation, we can't help but realize that everyone is vulnerable all the time. Now, I don't remember that incident because it happened in 1972 and I was only 2 years old, but I remember 1979. I remember the Iran hostage crisis, and I remember when the Shah of Iran was trying to find a place to go, and the United States said that he could come to the United States for cancer treatment, and as a result, hostages were taken at the embassy in Iran, and that crisis lasted for 444 days. It was the kind of situation you never forget. When your childhood is taken away and the country's innocence is taken away. What happened during that crisis is people would tie yellow ribbons around trees to remember the hostages. There's a song, "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round an Old Oak Tree to Remember Me." And that is what Americans were doing, and they felt their government had no power. We were powerless to rescue our own citizens who were being held hostage. Even though President Carter tried to rescue the hostages, what happened was, as the transport for the military team was refueling in the air, it collided with the tanker, and everybody on board died, and the rescue operation was a complete disaster. The U.S. Secretary of State resigned the next day. His name was Cyrus Vance. And President Carter most likely lost his bid for re-election because of that, even though it wasn't his fault. It was just something that happened. So the Iran hostage crisis is another example of this terror that people feel when they're not safe in a place that they feel they should be safe. This was just the beginning. Today, we have shootings in schools, we have shootings in movie theaters, and it's not simply a group from outside, and it's not Islamic extremists, as some people would like us to believe, always committing the terrorism. Yes, there are many who have extreme beliefs and they are from another religion, but there are some who are homegrown, who come from our own country and want to hurt people in this country. We'll talk about them next. We do need to talk about some who have been Islamic extremists, and we can't be shy about saying that term. We need to know that sometimes people are extreme in Islam, and sometimes people are extreme in Christianity or in other religions. And we need to look at ourselves first, and we need to ask ourselves, how do we feel? Are we open to the way other people think? Are we willing to listen to them? Are we willing to live with them and treat them as equal human beings? And so Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden get probably the darkest reputation, because they have not only been terrorists against the United States, they've been terrorists against their own religion, giving Islam such an awful reputation, even though it's not justified to think of Islam as perpetrating this violence. It's a black mark, and we do the same when we are unkind and when we speak evil things as Christians. And so we need to remember, Al-Qaeda came about because U.S. soldiers were in Saudi Arabia because of the Gulf War. We sent hundreds of thousands of troops almost 500,000 troops. We sent to Saudi Arabia to protect Saudi Arabia. But when we did that, we were infidels. We were not Muslims, and we were on Muslim soil. We were close to Mecca, and people like Osama bin Laden felt that that was too much, and his goal was to get American troops out of Saudi Arabia. His father was a very rich man in a construction company, who owned a construction company, and it was that money that went to begin the organization called Al-Qaeda and supported that terrorism until they perpetrated the atrocities of 9/11 in destroying the World Trade Center towers and killing 3,000 people and also attacking the Pentagon. That was Islamic extremism, Islamist terrorism, Muslim terrorism. And again, in a minute, I will be talking about people who might say that we also have Christian terrorism. It brings shame to me that can even be possible. There are many organizations that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda and that have continue to carry out the desire to establish a Muslim conservative extremist state. They want to overthrow a government and establish a Muslim government that takes people back to the very strictest interpretation of their holy text, the Quran, and Muhammad's ideas, basically saying that women should never be educated and should cover themselves completely in the burqa. And it's important that we understand that these are anomalies. These are groups that are not at the center of that religion. So one we need to know about is ISIS, which obviously has been in the news a lot. That stands for Islamic State in Syria, and there's another name for it called Islamic State in the Levant, and that simply means that they are in the area of Iraq and Palestine, and they want to establish a state that's run by a strict Muslim government, a priesthood that makes people obey. So ISIS is one group. Another is ISIS in the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, rather. Aqim, A-Q-I-M, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. And the other is Boko Haram. And finally, we have Al-Shabaab. These are all organizations that are gaining strength in relatively poor or developing countries where the government doesn't have the strength or isn't as efficient in rooting out terrorism and getting rid of terrorist threats. Boko Haram is most famous for its kidnapping. In 2014, in the city of Chibok, in Borno State, in Nigeria, 276 female students were kidnapped. They were basically high school students. They were kidnapped from an all-girls school. And again, because Boko Haram believes that women should not be educated, they do not want any Western type education from Europe because they think it contaminates the people. They are violent against those kinds of schools. Earlier, Boko Haram had attacked a school for boys, had killed 57 boys and burned down the school. Another time, they killed 100 Christian men in some villages. Again, they see Christianity as their enemy. They see anybody who is different as their enemies. They are carrying out evil against anyone who is different from the way they feel people should be. So there are many groups that are a part of what we call Muslim terrorism. But I want to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning. Did you make an assumption that the Munich Olympic attack was done by Muslims? I made that mistake. They were not Muslims. They were actually protesting the evacuation of 2 Christian villages in Palestine after the 1948 Israeli-Arab War, the 6 Days War. And the sad thing is the leader of that group was basically the child of Christian and Jewish parents. And he believed that the Palestinians had been treated so badly that he was willing to commit violence against the Israelis and against anyone who got in his way. It was not Muslims who committed that atrocity. And it was not Muslims who hijacked that airplane. They were members of a group called Black September, and truly it was not only a Black September, it was a Black October when that plane was hijacked afterwards. But we need to avoid making assumptions. We need to realize that we are all capable of terrible things, and we need to constantly be humble and realize that when people are different from us, we need to listen. We can have our convictions, but we need to have open arms and open hearts. From this type of international terrorism that maybe only affected Americans through their television screens and from far away, we turn now to homegrown terrorism. It's easy to think that terrorism is always done by people who are our enemies and who are different from us. But the reality is that there have been many incidents, terrible atrocities committed by people who are Americans. It's Americans killing Americans, often because of their political agendas. We need to look at homegrown terror, and I need to say as well that this is often the result of white supremacy. White supremacy and white nationalism is often the fuel in our country for terrorists to think that they can get away with attacking people who are Americans or who are different and who are in our country. They attack those people because they're different and because they think white people are somehow better. And this is part of our discussion right now, but we're going to start with something that seems very innocent. Many people disagreed with what the government was doing in Vietnam, in fighting the Vietnam War. They believed the government was lying to them. They believed that the government was carrying out atrocities against another country and its people. And as a result, they felt justified to rise up. Very similar to what Northerners felt during the Civil War as they rose up to violently attack those who were committing immoral acts and holding people as slaves and trying to divide the country because of that issue. When we understand it that way, when we see that people sometimes stand up for their morals and believe they are justified in committing violence, we can start to understand their feelings, but that doesn't make it right. One group that committed violence and could have killed many people was called the Weather Underground. And they started out as a group called the Weathermen, and their name came from a Bob Dylan song. Again, something so innocent. Bob Dylan was a singer and songwriter who created poetry speaking out against violence, speaking out against the Vietnam War and the bad things that were happening in society, particularly to African Americans, the civil unrest because of race. He was a fighter for the good, and he fought in non-peaceful ways, in non-violent ways. And so a song lyric from Bob Dylan goes, "You don't need a weatherman. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing." And so the weathermen felt that they were carrying out that same kind of an idea, that they knew which way the wind was blowing, and they were going to show the country how to overthrow their own government and to keep it from fighting these immoral wars overseas. And so the Weather Underground, it was a group that started from a very innocent cause, and we need to go back just a little bit more to understand it better. In 1968, at the Democratic Convention, many people were there to decide who would run for president against Richard Nixon, and there were many protesters who actually supported many of the things that the Democrats were fighting for. They wanted to end the war in Vietnam. They wanted to have civil rights in our country. So two groups were involved. One was called the Students for a Democratic Society, and another was the Yippies. The Yippies sounds like hippies, but they had a little bit different agenda. They were the Youth International Party, and they wanted to push things further than the hippies were doing. They actually protested very vocally and sometimes in very funny ways. For example, they wanted to nominate a pig for president, and the pig had a name. His name was Pegasus, and he was going to be nominated to be president of the United States. And the idea was the people who are in charge are already like pigs in what they're doing. Okay, so at that convention, the police were attacked. They were attacked by the students throwing things at them, including really disgusting things. And eventually, the police fired tear gas into the crowd, and 8 of the protesters were arrested, and they were known as the Chicago 8. One of them avoided prosecution, and so it became the Chicago 7. And these were 7 individuals who were protesting against the Vietnam War, against this political system that seemed corrupt. And that, in turn, fueled the Weathermen and the Weather Underground movement. Well, the Weather Underground took it to the next level, and they were violently trying to overthrow the U.S. government. They exploded a bomb at Congress, at the Capitol building. They exploded a bomb at the Pentagon. They were carrying out terrorist attacks on U.S. soil in order to overthrow the government. Now, when the Vietnam War technically ended in 1973 through the peace accords, the Paris Peace Accords, the group basically faded away. But that wasn't the end of violence in the United States against Americans. The next group we need to address is the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army. And basically this is a ragtag group of people who had an idea that they could commit violence for anti-fascist, anti-racist, feminist, anti-war people everywhere. They believed that they could unite all of those antis into a symbiotic relationship. So the Symbionese name comes from symbiotic, means living together peacefully. So the irony is this SLA, this army with machine guns and ready to rob banks, they believed that they were fighting so that everybody could live together peacefully. It was a crazy time. And what they did is they actually killed a couple of people in their operations, and then they kidnapped one of the most famous people in America, at least from one of the most famous families. The family of William Randolph Hearst owned the San Francisco Examiner and newspapers across the country and were basically a billionaire family. Patty Hearst was a student at the University of California, Berkeley, and the SLA kidnapped Patty Hearst from Berkeley. The thing is, then she started becoming one of them, and it seemed like she was actually holding the gun when she was robbing, and they were robbing banks, and she was a part of what they were doing. This was one of the most famous situations in the 1970s, and it was a symbol of what was happening to tear apart the country. So the SLA committed terrorism in the United States against Americans. In addition, you have the ELF, the Environmental Liberation Front. And this was a group that basically believed that the environment was being polluted and disrupted because of human beings. And so they were ready to do whatever they could to get rid of that problem, including burning down ski lodges when they impacted the environment. And so ELF is still around today. You'll see occasional episodes where the ELF is trying to make themselves known and to attack people who are hurting the environment. Again, when people got in their way, they were ready to do away with those people. With the next incident, we see that these acts of violence can be like dominoes, one leading to the next, leading to the next. And so in 1992, at a place called Ruby Ridge in Idaho, Randy Weaver was a man who basically was wanted on firearms charges and was ordered to appear in court, and he resisted. And marshals went to his compound, and there was a gun battle. People were killed on both sides, and the Weavers refused to surrender. As a result, the FBI went in with snipers, and eventually Weaver's wife was killed, and his son was killed, and Andy Weaver himself actually wasn't killed. But, some people would say he was responsible for the deaths of his family members. In any case, people disagreed about the handling of the government by the government in this situation, the handling of this situation, and it became an issue for people to think about. What was the role of government? When should the government come in with force to enforce the law? In 1993, there was another tragedy that was related to the government, and it had to do with a group called the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. And we will discuss this a little bit later at the end of this video series. But the Branch Davidians, they refused to have any sort of engagement with authorities. And when the government came in, they basically resisted, and eventually the government came in with more force after a long standoff, and the Branch Davidians burned down their own compound, or somehow something that was maybe shot into the compound set everything on fire. But there's evidence that the members of the cult actually were killed by their own people, that somebody shot them in the process of this compound burning down. So whether they set the fire themselves or whether the authorities set it unintentionally or maybe even intentionally, this was an ugly confrontation, and it was going to lead to even worse things. Now, that happened on April 19th, and unfortunately April 19th and April 20th have become an anniversary date that has created more and more violence. In 1994, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, primarily, it could be that there were others involved, but those two individuals, former military, they decided that they were going to attack the U.S. government. And they would attack the federal building in Oklahoma City, and they created a fertilizer bomb. I know that sounds unbelievable, but ammonium nitrate can be used as an explosive, and it was packed into a truck, and the truck was parked in front of the building, and it exploded, and more than 150 people were killed. I will never forget being in Taiwan and reading the U.S. newspapers or the English newspapers there and seeing what was happening and wondering what was going on and why the world had turned upside down and why Americans were killing Americans. I could not understand it. And unfortunately, this has not stopped. On April 20th in 1999, two shooters went into a high school named Columbine High School in Colorado near Denver, and they executed students because those students represented the bullying that they had experienced, or maybe were just members of groups that they didn't respect. But they went into a school and carried out the biggest mass shooting and mass killing in history, and then they killed themselves. And this has inspired numerous school shootings since that time. Now, the really awful part is that we might ask, why April 20th? There's evidence that this is because it was Hitler's birthday. And so the dominoes just keep falling, and we need to be on guard. We need to understand that recent shootings that are taking place in synagogue in Pittsburgh and in Poway, near San Diego, the shooting that happened there, these are heinous incidents that They can be avoided if we wake up and if we start working together to solve these problems. And unfortunately, many people just want to look the other way, and they figure that these things will always happen. The thing is, they haven't always happened. Something is very wrong, and it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for our country to address homegrown terror and realize that the wars that we're fighting are not just overseas, that we are fighting for hearts and souls in our own country. When we think of terrorism, we often think of small bands of people who have a grudge against a government or an organization, and they secretly plot an attack on that organization. That's not always how it works. In fact, there is such a thing as state-sponsored terrorism. Today, there are many countries that actually actively support terrorism. Many people would say that the United States supports terrorism because we send out our soldiers into other countries and attack people, and sometimes innocent people die. But what I'm talking about is very different. It's a country that doesn't fight with soldiers. It fights with everyday people going into another country and attacking everyday people, and then denies that they're doing it. This is very evil. It's something that has happened that strikes fear into people, and that's the whole purpose. One country wants to have more power in the world, in the area that they are in, and so they carry out terrorist attacks, or they provide money or material support for a terrorist group. This is what happened in Afghanistan before 9/11. Afghanistan, the government was controlled by the Taliban, an extremist group, and that group allowed Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda terrorist organization to come and train in camps. And those camps then, they learned how to be terrorists, they learned how to shoot guns, they learned how to make bombs, and they learned how to get into a country, and then eventually they learned how to fly planes in the United States, and then they took over airplanes and crashed them into buildings. That was state-sponsored terrorism. And it's even worse for a country like Iran, which supports a group called Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a group that is mainly in South Lebanon, and they are supported by the Iranian government. Another terrorist organization supported by Palestine is Hamas. In fact, Hamas runs the Gaza Strip, which is a portion of the Palestinian state. So you have the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Those are the two main areas together that make up what we call Palestine today. Now, back in 1948, there was a crisis. In fact, it started in 1947, same time that India was being partitioned. The United Nations had a plan so that the Jewish people could have their own state. And so the British controlled Palestine, which is the Holy Land, the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River and the Dead Sea and Jerusalem. The British were in control all the way back to World War I. They took it over from the Ottoman Empire, which fell apart. You remember Lawrence of Arabia and his efforts to develop an Arab homeland and an Arab nation. Well, Palestine was controlled by the British, and it was called a British Mandate. That means they had the authority over that area. And the idea for the United Nations, and remember, the UK was one of the 5 Security Council members, one of the 5 permanent members, and the Security Council came up with the plan to divide up Palestine into an Israel and a Palestine. The problem was Arab nations in the area that had just gained their independence from the UK and from France, they did not want any part of this. They immediately were battling against this because basically it would mean that those Palestinian Arab Muslims were now under Jewish control or Israeli control. And so they started to form an alliance, and eventually they declared war, and they all attacked Israel. Now, miraculously, Israel survived in 1948 and established their own country by taking over 60% of the portion that was going to be the Palestinian state. So that is why 700,000 Palestinians were forced to become refugees, and all the way into the 1980s, there were refugee camps of these displaced Palestinians who could not go back. They could not return to their homes. And then, you had 700,000 Jewish people who had been forced to leave their homes in the Middle East, and they emigrated to Israel. So very much like what happened in India. If you were Muslim in the Indian portion, in the Hindu portion, you had to go to the other side, to Pakistan. And if you were Hindu living in Pakistan, you had to go to India. And so there was this massive swap. And it was literally 700,000 for 700,000. Now, that wasn't the end of the conflict. In 1967, you had the second part of the trilogy. And it was another terrible war, but it was very short. It was a 6-day war. And again, miraculously, Israel was able to defeat Egypt and gain even more territory in the Gaza Strip. Now, the PLO is the organization that then basically in 1965, it was fighting for Palestinian, the Palestinian ability to have the area controlled by Israel. And it was an armed uprising and involved terrorist attacks. So the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, was responsible for terrorist attacks against Israeli citizens that ultimately escalated to that 1967 6-day war. That didn't end it. There was a third part of the trilogy. So the third part of the Arab-Israeli trilogy was the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And this was basically the next part of the saga. Remember, Israel had dominated Egypt in 1967 and had taken over the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. Well, in 1973, Egypt had as its main objective to try and get back the Sinai Peninsula. And because of early successes that it had, it got a little bit of land, just the eastern part of the Suez Canal, and basically almost cut off Israel from the Suez Canal. That eventually led in 1978 to the Camp David peace accords between Egypt and Israel, and Israel then returned the Sinai to Egypt. So that was a hopeful sign. And in 1993, you had the Oslo Accords, where President Clinton orchestrated a kind of peace between Yasser Arafat and Shimon Peres of Israel. And it was a moment where it truly could be a new beginning. Unfortunately, things have kind of stalled since then, and there's been a lot of hostility, and there's a wall between Palestine and Israel. And now the United States has moved our embassy to Jerusalem, which is a flashpoint because Jerusalem is divided into an east and a west Jerusalem. And both sides claim all of Jerusalem. So it all comes down to Jerusalem, like so many other things in life. So Israel has occupied the West Bank and has occupied the Golan Heights, and they have built settlements there because they basically are saying, these are our territories now. We're not going to give them back, because Palestine and the Arab world have refused to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. So this conflict is creating terrorism, and it's died down a little bit recently. Israel has very high technological capabilities and a very strong military. They've built a wall to keep out any Palestinian terrorists. But as a result, Palestinians are living in a state of apartheid. And it is a devastating situation economically and socially for those Palestinians. And you see youths who are getting angrier, and they want to fight against Israel, and it has not lessened. Now, Iran supports Hezbollah, and Hamas is supported by other Sunni nations, and largely they are Sunni Muslims in Palestinian territories. And Hamas actually won the election. It's an incredible thing. In 2006, they won the majority, and basically that was the end of their unity. It's a very difficult situation because the two territories are separate. They are not contiguous, and as a result, just like India, it was very hard to govern. Now Palestine, the PLO controls only the West Bank territory, and that's the only place that really is recognized in the world. And again, Hezbollah is supported by Iran and the Iran Revolutionary Guard, which is kind of a terrorist organization of its own, the military of the Islamic Republic in Iran. In addition, you have places like North Korea that are sponsoring terrorism of a different kind, cyber terror. They actually have attacked Sony and stole information and then exposed people in Sony and showed the world that their information wasn't safe with Sony. And so that was one attack that happened. Basically, it was a retaliation for a movie that Sony released, which was making fun of North Korea. And in addition, maybe the most serious one to consider today is the Russian Federation and their use of internet trolls. There is a troll factory in St. Petersburg, and that means it's called the Internet Research Agency, and it's basically a spy agency, and it's designed to create disinformation. So it's intentionally misleading people in order to win a political battle. And people have concluded that it affected the 2016 election for president in the United States. Now, this agency is basically funded by Russian oligarchs. Oligarchs are the richest people in a country. An oligarchy is a government run by rich people or run by a few people. And sometimes we call it a kleptocracy because it's people who are stealing from the government who run the government. And that's kind of what's happening. These rich people, they make their money at the expense of average people. And that is state-sponsored terrorism of a different kind from Russia. Now we need to spend just a little time talking about the special state-sponsored terrorism in Afghanistan. Now, I've already told you that Osama bin Laden, with the permission of the Taliban government, had terrorist training camps within Afghanistan. But the story of the Taliban goes back to 1996 when the Taliban took over the government and created a totalitarian state, an Islamic state, in which Sharia law would be the law of the land, and that meant that women could not be educated. In addition, anybody who was in opposition to this group, the Taliban, they were persecuted. And the Taliban basically destroyed fertile farms. They destroyed the food of people who were against them. They refused to accept any food supplies from the United Nations for the 160,000 people who were starving. And in addition, they fought a cultural battle. They blew up historic, precious artifacts that represented other religions. And so their idea was to remake Afghanistan. And they control about 3/4 of the country. Honestly, the United States didn't think much about the Taliban. It was a faraway threat. It wasn't an immediate national security risk. And then in 2000, the USS Cole was in Aden, which is in Yemen, and it was just basically stopping for a routine refueling and getting supplies. And a small fiberglass boat came up alongside the ship with 2 suicide bombers, and there were C2 explosives on the boat, and it blew a 40 by 60 foot gash in the hull of that destroyer, and it killed 17 people and dozens more were injured. It was a wake-up call for the United States, and it took place just before the election of 2000, which was a very contentious election. And the idea, again, was how to keep the United States safe. And I think that probably that did some damage to the campaign of Vice President Al Gore, who could have been president except for a few hundred votes in Florida. And so after the Cole attack, you'd think that the United States would be on red alert, but about a year later, September 11th happened. And it was basically the same group that was responsible. It was Al-Qaeda, although the Cole attack had been sponsored by Sudan. There was a connection between Sudan and the extremist group and the extremist dictator there and Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda group. And so 9/11 was a dramatically orchestrated attack involving 4 teams of 5 terrorists on 4 planes, and the 4th plane actually was flown into a field in Pennsylvania because apparently the passengers on board that plane took control of the plane. But 2 planes struck the World Trade Center and 1 struck the Pentagon. So those 4 planes were the terrorist plot of 9/11. And it was very successful, tragically successful. That sparked immediately a month later Operation Enduring Freedom. And this was the U.S. response, along with allies through NATO and throughout the world, who were going to bring justice to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but also the country that sponsored him and that housed him. And so Afghanistan was attacked. And it took about a month, and Afghanistan was no longer able to control its airspace. And basically the United States quickly dominated by air and was bombing the country, but then had to send in ground forces. And that war still rages to this day. Even though most of the troops have been withdrawn, there was a time called the Surge, and this was a very important point of the war. Basically, General Petraeus, who was the general responsible for Afghanistan and responsible for our troops abroad, he worked together along with other generals. They were working to build bridges, to build relationships with the people in the country, and to give them confidence that the United States were not coming as conquerors, and that together they had to fight against the Taliban. So Operation Enduring Freedom has been Operation Enduring Warfare. There's no guarantee that there will be long-term success in Afghanistan. Troops have been mostly withdrawn, but there are enough people, enough American soldiers there that we need to make sure that we pay attention. Things can change very quickly, and the Taliban currently they are looking to have peace talks, and they're looking for a political resolution to this long drawn-out war. But even then, the only thing that can be said really for sure is that through the war in Afghanistan, which came about because of 9/11, the people of Afghanistan have been able to vote, and the women there have been able to become educated. And perhaps that is the greatest hope for change. So in one fell swoop, we're going to try and touch on the remaining hot spots that represent terrorism and threats to world security. Obviously, you have the situation that's going on in Afghanistan, which is still unresolved. There are hopeful signs that maybe there can be a peaceful resolution to a long, violent war. But most people familiar with the area, they aren't holding their breath. In addition, you have wars now in Yemen, and it's a civil war, and it's been going on since 2015. It largely came out of the Arab Spring movement, and a very unpopular dictator was removed from power, and then basically you have a religious war between Sunnis and Shiites, and the Sunnis are supported by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and you also have the Shiites supported by Iran, and they are supporting a revolutionary rebel group called the Houthi rebels. And they are, again, they're Shiite rebels who want to change the country to be Shiite rather than Sunni. And this is a microcosm of what's going on all over the Middle East. You have Iran, who's Shiite. You have Iraq, which is mainly Shiite, but there is a large Sunni minority, and that's why Iraq had such violence over the decades. And then you have other countries like Lebanon, and Lebanon is largely Shiite, and Jordan is Sunni. And so all these countries, they're grouped together, and they are ready to fight each other at a moment's notice, even though they belong to the same general background. In Iran, we currently have a face-off between the United States and Iran regarding their nuclear program and their support for terrorism around the world, and especially in the Middle East, and their desire to expand their influence. And this has been going on for some time, as I just mentioned, with the Houthi rebels in Yemen. But Iran has been a part of an agreement with the United States, a hard-fought agreement to suspend their nuclear program. And recently, the United States basically disavowed that agreement, and one thing has led to another, and Iran is now feeling as if they are forced to fight back. And so the situation is fluid, and there could be conflict in Iran at any time. In Syria, the ongoing civil war has generally died down. ISIS has been defeated in Syria, more or less, or at least fragmented and scattered for the time being. And the government of Syria is ready to restore its power, its dictatorial power over the country. And for sure, there will be punishment for the rebels who have fought against the government. It's been a genocide. And unfortunately, Western nations have been helpless to do anything about it. In Sudan, there has been fighting between Sudan and South Sudan, and this is an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing conflict, but the biggest news is that the leader of Sudan has been overthrown in a coup d'etat, and so maybe there's hope now for some sort of reconciliation and peace between the two parts of Sudan. And finally, you have Ukraine, which is an ongoing conflict in the Donetsk region, an industrial region in eastern Ukraine, largely Russian-speaking, and that's why Russia has gotten involved and basically established their authority over that portion of Ukraine, as well as the Crimean Peninsula, which gives it great Baltic Sea access. Black Sea access, rather. Black Sea access. So those are hot spots in the world, and we need to know our geography, know your Baltic from your Black Sea, and pay attention to day-to-day events that could lead to further consequences for everyone, including us in the United States. Sometimes places seem so far away, but our world is getting smaller. Thanks for watching.